Okay, everyone, good afternoon. We're going to go ahead and get started here. Today's topic is attribution in Google Analytics 360. I know this is a real hot issue with a lot of folks, and we're going to talk a little bit more about it. This is actually part one of two. Today, we're going to cover some of the technical aspects, which we'll get into the details of it, as well as some specifics that I hope you guys are interested in hearing about. Now, this session will be recorded and made available to you on demand later in the week. And additionally as well, if you guys do have any questions, the chat box is open and the QA section is as well. So at any point, if you have a question, feel free to drop it into the Q&A section and I will address it as best I can. I would highly encourage you guys to ask questions. That's one of the biggest benefits to interactive webinar, right, is getting your questions answered and talking to me. I don't know if you've ever delivered a webinar or presentation before where nobody talks to you. It's kind of rough, so please do ask me all of the questions you might have. I may defer some of those to the part two. I may also defer some of those to offline. So please don't hesitate to ask these questions. And I promise you as well that if you want to know something, there's likely going to be somebody else in the room that has the same question. So, be bold, be first, and go ahead and ask it. So today's agenda for part one is we're going to talk through the technical details of attribution. We're going to talk about how attribution works. We're going to talk about the various different attribution channels, including data-driven attribution, that feature, advertising integrations, and cost data import. Now, some of the reporting aspects are going to happen in part two on September 9th, which I believe that data is confirmed. You guys can actually go onto the site and register for that as well. It will be me once again, and we'll be talking more about goal configuration. We'll get into the nitty-gritty of some regular expressions, talk through default channel attribution reporting model, and as well as default channel grouping reporting and customization, as well as the multi-channel funnels in the attribution report. That's where you essentially can build out those projects. Now, this is my agenda, but a lot of your questions are going to dictate the topics that we talk about. So I am unafraid to go into the weeds on some of this. I absolutely love talking about this stuff. So please do ask those questions. And just a reminder too, this will be recorded. This will be made available. So feel free to sit back, to relax, and in confidence that we know that this is going to be recorded somewhere and shareable. So if you have a friend or a colleague that couldn't make it, you can go ahead and share that out as well. So a little bit about InfoTrust. We are a digital analytics company. We don't sell media. We do more than analytics. We do implementations, integrations, analysis. We are a Google Marketing Platform sales partner. We're a premier partner. One of the things that we do quite a bit is work with folks who use Google Analytics 360. It's very common for us to jump on board with those teams and become a valued partner to those groups. We also do have a proprietary product called Tag Inspector, which is a scanning tool that's used for auditing and data governance. It's fantastic, and you guys can surely check it out. And we have offices all over the world, from Cincinnati, Columbus, Chicago, Dubai, Barcelona. Although I'm sure, as most of you are, we're all working remote as well. So, these Zoom meetings and these webinars do bring us together. A little bit about me. My name is Dave Fimek. I am a lead analytics consultant with InfoTrust. I actually got my start in analytics with the U.S. Navy as an intelligence analyst. So I got some amazing training and did quite a bit of work for various different clandestine services. After I got out, I don't know if you've ever seen the resume of an ex-spy, but it's all redacted. So I had a little trouble jumping right into working as an analyst, mostly because the industry was so new. It really wasn't something that people were interested in. They were more interested in web development. So I started doing web development work. And eventually I created my own freelance business, developing, hosting, and marketing websites. While I was doing that, I would always sneak in analytics as kind of something to do and to measure success, which rose to prominence and importance as the years weathered on. And eventually I got hired into consulting work via the Google Partner Academy. I had gotten an invite to come and get some free training that was part of the Google Partner Academy, and afterwards I approached the presenter and got hired on to that group. I've been doing this for about 15 years as a consultant. So I've worked in, I think, every vertical. I've done hundreds of implementation deployments. I've been working with GTM a few months before its release. I've been working with Google Analytics before it was actually purchased by Google, back when it was urgent. Eventually, of course, I found a home in InfoTrust at the start of 2019, and I've been here and loving it ever since. You can connect with me personally on LinkedIn. That's usually the best place to chat me up, send me a message, ask me questions. So if you do have follow-up questions that maybe you don't want to send an email, just go ahead and add me on LinkedIn, and we'll talk. So what we're here to talk about today, and I like to start this with a story because, as I mentioned before, attribution is very personal for a lot of folks. And usually when I think about understanding attribution and my experience with attribution, it stems from like years ago when I was invited to a client's quarterly business review. They had rounded up all their agency partners to sit down with them and give the top brass essentially a lay of the land in terms of their data, their media buy, that sort of thing. I'm sure a lot of people in this webinar have been part of a similar meeting like that. And one lesson I learned during this meeting that this attribution is very personal, is something that is extremely important to all involved. Now, typically my role with clients is purely analytics, just data. I don't buy media. I have no horse in the race when it comes to marketing costs or campaign success. Everything I do is all about measurement and making sure my client has the data to be as informed as possible. So as the meeting weathered on and presentation after presentation came up and said their piece, you can start to sense the frustration in the room and the client's frustration, as every single agency at that table took credit for bringing in sales, bringing in business, and bringing in growth. And the real problem was that the whole reason the meeting was called for this particular client was that they had a quarter that they were underperforming sales-wise. So needless to say, the math didn't quite add up, as everyone was attributing their contributions from their particular initiatives as the reason for some sort of sales success. And often they'd be citing the same data as their reasoning. For example, a few of them even pointed to a bump in direct traffic as the rationality behind why they felt their marketing efforts were successful. So afterward, I had to give my presentation, which was in complete conflict with everything else. So everybody was around the table just trying to gobble up credit, and then I had to come in and basically say, this is it from a data perspective. Needless to say, I didn't make any friends, and I wouldn't say this meeting was terribly successful. All the presentations from the agencies stemmed from a fundamental misunderstanding of how attribution works, and it is absolutely paramount. It is critical to understand how contributions are related to success. What ended up happening was, but because these reports were so much in conflict, the client ended up losing trust in their data and the confidence in their partners because of it. So I wanted to talk to you today about how attribution works. And, hopefully, if you do find yourself in a similar situation, whether you're the client, the analyst, or the marketing agency, you can build your report on a solid foundation of knowledge of how this all comes together. So today I'm going to talk to you about the technical aspects of attribution. I developed this content with it addressing the technical aspects and in as non-technical manner as I can possibly present it. So I'm not going to throw code at you or anything like that. I can talk to that all you'd like, but this is more of a presentation for, again, folks that are analysts or anything like that, not necessarily developers or implementation specialists. So in order to properly report attribution, you really do need to understand how it's collected and processed. Otherwise, you're not really going to reasonably able to analyze it. So what is attribution in GA? Let's just take a giant step back to just define this concept as a whole, right? Attribution is essentially the assigning of credit for a session data and to an external initiative for the purpose of understanding that initiative's contribution to achieving strategic objectives. Attribution primarily focuses around goal conversions that are triggered during a user's session. Attribution is weighted based on models that determine what percentage of the credit should apply to what touch point in the user's path to conversion. And as part of analysis, you should be layering on and comparing multiple attribution models in order to understand how your marketing channels work and fit together. Attribution asks and then answers who gets the credit for the conversion and how much credit should they receive. So let's dive into it. Let's figure out under the hood how this process works and how attribution comes together, right? So we have a couple of steps in the user's journey here. And first and foremost, it's going to start with the execution of the code. The user visits your website and the analytics code executes. Now, this could occur via several different means. Typically, it's going to be deployed out via tag management systems such as Google Tag Manager, Telium, Insighten, something along those lines. Once that code executes alongside a wide array of other functions that are happening, such as recording the user's resolution or what browser they're in or the page view or anything like that. As part of this process, it's going to move on to user identification. Google Analytics is going to look in the user's browser for an assigned ID. That's essentially going to ask, do I know this user presently? And if no user ID is found, one is created and assigned to that user. This is generally what that cookie is doing. It houses a unique identifier that says, hey, this user is so-and-so. So across different sessions, that user can be tracked back and those sessions can be tethered together. Now, the page URL is processed. As part of this, it's going to record a page view. It's going to want to know what page all of this activity is happening. So the page URL is grabbed, and if there are marketing parameters, it populates it with those appropriate dimensions. So if no UTM parameters are present, GA reaches into the browser to determine the referring source. So it's going to attempt to intelligently find, based on what it knows about the user, where that user has come from. Then after that, attribution is assigned. So GA then classifies that user's session based on what it discovers during that process there. Now, attribution assignment can be influenced, starting with the UTM parameters mentioned earlier. However, there are configuration options that can also impact it. So for example, within your admin panel under the web properties, the organic search sources is where you can define traffic from certain domains as organic. So if you wanted to, if you had a website that was forwarding traffic to you, and then you visited the website to determine that it is in fact an organic search engine that perhaps Google's automation hasn't figured out yet, you can add it into that list. There's also a referral exclusion list that will exclude domains in it, and those will actually be considered direct. So this is very common for cross-domain setup or putting your own domain into it. So for example, if I run InfoTrust.com, I'm going to have InfoTrust.com as a referral exclusion list because I don't want self-referrals. When that list is populated with a domain that the user is coming from, it will determine that that user is instead direct, which we'll talk a little bit more about direct traffic here in a bit. Now, a session expires after 30 minutes and no additional hits. That can sometimes happen. Someone leaves the browser open. This commonly happens actually on tabs on mobile phones. So after 30 minutes, if Google Analytics has not received a follow-up hit, it determines that the user is timed out, there's no longer there, and ends the session. However, if that user comes back to their phone or to their tab and resumes their activity, that could create a new session and make it seem like it's coming direct. Now, there are also other ways to enhance attribution accuracy by bolstering the system's ability to identify users. I get that quite a bit. When we're doing implementations and we're looking for better ways to increase the accuracy and enhance the data, one of the things that we'll do is actually beef up the user identification process of the system. So some of you are going to operate websites in which the user has the ability to identify themselves to you in some regard, such as a login, right? Obviously, that's going to be the most common. So if I'm on your website and I want to buy one of your products, I may have to register an account. Additionally, maybe I want to sign up for an email and I have to identify myself. So once I'm on your site and I register as a user for that, you could actually build out a specific view and specific implementation features that essentially stamp that user with an ID that you provided as opposed to the random ID that Google Analytics would provide it. Where this ID comes from is actually the main challenge when it comes to doing this. Typically, I see this come from a content management system or a customer relations manager. So, for example, if you have your Salesforce CRM configured to manage the accounts, you could send that user ID from Salesforce back, stamp that user with it in GA, and then have continuity across both platforms. One option that you can enable that will enact at the attribution assign step is session unification. So if I had previous sessions where I didn't log in and I was assigned a random ID, what will happen is if you have session unification enabled, it will tether together that user session even before it knew that user was that user, simply because that ID lined up at the time of overwriting. Now, this is a really great way to build continuity in your users. And if you do have some sort of authentication system or means to identify your user, obviously ethically, you're going to want to enable something like this. On a technical level, it's not too terribly difficult to implement, but the difficult part, as I mentioned before, is typically retrieving that user ID from whatever backend system that you want. And as I mentioned before, typically this comes from the CRM or CMS. So there are some general attribution channels. We're not going to cover every single one of them, but I do want to touch on some of the key ones that are very common. Some of you may already be pretty experienced in this, but I do actually want to add a little bit of clarification around a few of the common ones. Now, when that process is happening and Google reaches back into that user's browser to determine stuff, there is some proprietary logic that Google is employing here to essentially determine what channels they're fitting into. And I think the one that I see that is confused the most is direct traffic. Now, most people, when they think of direct traffic, they think of the common definition of somebody typing into their address bar, this is where I'm going. I'm going to InfsTrust.com, hit enter, and I landed direct. But in fact, when things are attributed to direct, it's actually Google's lack of ability to find any referral information. If it reaches back into your browser, it finds no cookies, no referral source, no data. Maybe there's a no refer link that was used to get there. It's going to see nothing and go, okay, I cannot determine any referral source, so I'm going to classify this source as direct. When you see a large spike in direct traffic, it could usually mean a few things. Oftentimes this could mean there is a campaign out there that you launched in that day that was not properly UTM tagged. Some of you may have seen that. So if I build out an email campaign, for example, and I do not put UTM tags on the links within the email and the users visit it, I will see a spike in direct traffic. I will not see a spike in any email traffic. Additionally, too, if there is an issue with a heavy amount of self-referrals, maybe from a tagging issue or a technical issue, this can also be miscategorized as direct. The best way to troubleshoot this is using something like Tag Inspector, where you're scanning your tags and constantly monitoring your tags to ensure that they're up to snuff and they're behaving as intended. So if you ever do launch a campaign or do have a notable effort and you notice a big bump in direct as opposed to where you expect it, that's a good time to start looking hard at your tracking as well as your campaign tagging process. I think the next ones are something that a few of the channels that most of us are familiar with. Organic, for example, this is when Google determines that the user has arrived via a search engine results page. This is where your SEO folks are going to be looking in terms of monitoring their success. Something I do like to flag with organic in terms of attribution, especially with organic, is that it's very regional based. A lot of people do, when they're doing SEO analysis, forget how important region is to organic traffic. For example, if I'm in Chicago here and I do a search for ice cream, it's going to be very different than if I do a search for ice cream in, say, Japan. You're going to get very different results, very different websites. So do keep in mind when reviewing this channel and understanding the attribution around this. This is largely SEO, and this is also heavily influenced by region. Referral traffic, the originating website is not a search engine, but rather a website. Referral traffic is very much like word of mouth, right? Somebody has gone in and added a link to their website. The most common places you're going to see referral traffic is actually going to be people adding your information to a community or publishing-based site, right? So if I go to a news website and say, hey, check out this website as part of the comments and provide that link, you may actually see referral traffic from that. Paid search, this is where, of course, a lot of folks are going to be spending their hard-earned company money, cost per click, things like that. And I'm lumping in paid search for both cost per click and display, that sort of thing. I'm speaking a little bit generally here. This is where a lot of the cost analysis is going to happen when you're understanding attribution. And honestly, I think this is where people spend their most time looking at this specific channel, mostly because most of the money is tied up in that. And then, of course, you have custom campaigns and all of that, which is essentially everything that is part of your UTM parameters. Now, when it comes to UTM parameters, there's some best practices, which we're not going to be talking about too much as part of this, but when you add in your UTM parameters, it may fall into different channel groupings. One of the things that I usually tell folks is, as part of the attribution channels and understanding how channels operate, you're not only going to want to keep an eye on that to make sure that it's correct, but also teach Google Analytics the unique aspects that you're bringing in. A lot of these channels, for example, direct, organic, referral, those are three channels you're never going to add UTM parameters around. You shouldn't ever have the medium of referral, mostly because you're injecting a very paid manual effort into areas that are supposed to be very organic and determined on their own. So when it comes to building out those default channel groupings or channel groupings in general, we're absolutely going to talk about that in session 2 when it comes to reporting. Now, the default attribution model for the vast majority of Google Analytics is called the last non-direct interaction attribution model, which essentially means that those channels that we had just talked about, any conversions will 100% be attributed the weight, the last known non-direct source. So anytime a user comes in direct, again, that's just the lack of any attributable source. When Google does its technical magic, it's going to go, okay, I didn't find any referral source, so I'm actually going to defer to the last time I saw this user, its previous session, to give it the weight of the conversion if this user does convert. So just some baseline examples here. If a user has 3 sessions, right, they go organic, paid campaign, and direct. So under the default channel attribution model, the paid campaign will receive 100% of the credit for the conversion. So if you guys are poking around in Google Analytics and you look in the acquisitions channel, the acquisitions report, the all traffic, the channels report, you will see the various different channels being attributed as the number of conversions. And these conversions happen all over, right? All over the reports. Through those reports, anything outside of the multi-channel funnels reports is going to attribute the last non-direct interaction as 100% of the success of that conversion. So for example, the second one here, they come in organic, they come in through a paid campaign. So they did an organic search, they did some research, and they did some research again after visiting the site that says, oh, here's an ad, let's try this. And then they come in direct 5 times. paid campaign will still get 100% of the credit for that conversion, simply because direct never overwrites it. And then alternatively, we have organic, paid campaign, direct, and social. So if social was the last one. So it's, again, always the last non-direct interaction that's going to be receive the credit. Yeah, so direct will never overwrite another channel in regard to attribution conversions. So another way to look at this as well, and this is also tethering into the idea of the user ID overwrite functionality, right? So if you look on the right side of the screen here, you have sessions going up, right? So if a user has a series of 4 sessions but converts on everything marked in blue, right? So let's say I'm jumping on your sites and I find it through organic search. I click on that from a search engine results page. I check it out. I like what I see. I remember your brands, and then I leave. So session 2, I go, hey, I remember InfoTrust. I remember this brand. So I'm going to go InfsTrust.com and I come back in through direct. So I continue to do some research. I read some blogs, so and so. Session 3, I still remember the brand name. I still remember InfoTrust. My 3rd session, I register. So at that point, I've identified myself to the system, to the configuration, to the implementation. And that's now, I actually converted. You know, that little star means I converted. Now, what the user ID functionality can do for you here is those previously unassigned session 1 and session 2, where our CRM didn't know who that user was, using session unification, it'll actually tether it back. So session 3, that conversion at that star for user registration, organic search is going to get all of the credit and the attribution model that's built into the pre-built reports. Now session 4, I'm still the same user. I'm still identifying. I'm seeing 4 different sessions as part of this user's journey. And I come in through paid search and I convert again. Maybe I bought a product from the store. And now I'm a user who's going to have 4 sessions, 2 conversions. And because of the user overwrite functionality and session unification, we have an understanding of all of the touch points from this particular user. So I know that's kind of a lot to take in. So I'm hoping that this visual does the trick for you guys in terms of understanding that. But I'm going to pause here for just a moment. I see that I do have a question, but feel free to drop in your questions as well while I'm reading through this. If you have any questions about this, and don't hesitate to ask questions. This stuff is, can be pretty complicated. So I'm here to kind of help you work through it. So one of the questions I have here is, what about traffic in these scenarios? If I visit from paid search and then direct, will paid search get 2 sessions? So when it comes to attribution, it's largely a conversion-based, conversion-based, right? When we're weighting conversions, we're doing it based on its last non-direct interaction. So in your scenario, if they came in from paid search and then direct and they didn't convert at all, you would just see sessions being credited as it would be paid search. Or if they convert, it'll be paid search. Where you can actually flesh this out is in the reporting within the multi-channel funnels report, which we'll actually talk about during our next session when we talk about reporting. Okay. So let's talk a little bit too about some enhanced features that are part of Google Analytics 360. So there is an enterprise iteration of Google Analytics. There's Google Analytics Standard and Google Analytics 360. A handful of these features are specific to GA 360. So if you're interested in talking a little bit more about 360, there'll be a poll after this just to essentially see if you're interested in talking to us more about it. But some of these features are only open to users with this license. But I don't want that to discourage you guys from tuning in or listening if it's not presently accessible. I can tell you right now that a lot of Google Analytics 360 features are features that debut as part of the enterprise platform and then eventually roll out to the standard version. I can't make any promises, and I certainly don't represent Google in that. But to give you a great example, custom dimensions way back in the day were originally exclusively a Google Analytics 360 feature. Multi-channel funnels back in the day before they rolled out the standard were originally a 360 feature. So these may also be something that are made available to you over time. But also to, if you are interested in getting a GA360 license, be sure to talk to us. One of the commonly confused aspects of attribution is the data-driven attribution enablement, right? So using integrations with other Google Analytics products, GA can build a custom attribution model with your data. So we talked about the default attribution model, which is last non-direct interaction. Data-driven attribution actually dynamically builds its own attribution model to weight conversions and weight credit. So the model incorporates factors such as time for conversion, device type, number of ad interactions, order of ad exposure, and the type of creative assets. This feature is driven by, it's called the Shapley value solution concept from game theory, and it weights axioms such as the items above to determine the conversion's weight. Now, I always joke, one of the reasons why I love analysts hate math, right? One of the reasons we're great at being analysts is because we find ways to automate math. And the Shapley value solution, I found a handful of brilliant videos by college professors all about how this works mathematically. But ultimately it just boils down to them using that solution based on a number of axioms or data points that it's sharing with other tools such as DoubleClick or anything else within the GMP. Now, this does require at least 600 conversions in 30 days. If it drops to less, your data in this manner will become unavailable. And this is a GA feature and has to be enabled at the view level. And this doesn't actually work with the user ID override functionality that I talked about previously. So this is a really interesting way and a really interesting model to apply to your conversions, simply because you're starting to incorporate more intelligent points of data that can essentially provide more depth to what a conversion is. I would not be surprised to see that last non-direct interaction model slowly go away over time. And to be honest, when it comes to reporting, it's almost at this point not enough to hold up to the scrutiny of most analysts nowadays, because they want to know more beyond the last interaction. They want to know all the steps. So I do have a question here. Let me just hit both. Let me just read them real fast, and please do keep with the questions. They're really helpful for me. So George has asked, it sounded like you had launched an email campaign yesterday and all the links were UTM tagged, but on your GA reports, you realized the majority of conversions were direct. That could be any number of things. As I mentioned before, direct could be indicative of a technical problem. And if you're confident in your UTM tags, it might be something else. What is pretty common in terms of attribution loss is when it comes to those UTM parameters being stripped out before the code executes on the page. So let me just take a couple of steps back here just to show that process one more time. So it all starts with the code execution, right? So the user's coming in, they're clicking on an external link in your email with those UTM parameters. In the event something happens before the code execution, before the user arrives, that removes those UTM parameters, that could essentially be the reason why you're losing attribution. So I most commonly see this when I'm looking at redirects. If you are using a website that uses like an SEO plugin that rewrites the URLs, that's a common culprit as well. Sometimes you also too, if you're working with a host that uses like an HT access file that does URL rewrites, that can also strip it off. So George, to your question, I would take a really hard look at any redirects that are happening within your email. So send the email to yourself, click on that link using a browser that can monitor the traffic or the redirects as it comes through. There are a handful of different Chrome extensions you can use to look at the redirects that are happening. And 9 times out of 10, at least in my experience, that is happening because the UTM parameters you are providing in the email are getting stripped off before this code execution phase. So another question here too, I believe it's in the chats. Is there a difference on desktop or any other device on session time? Session timing is determined by, in a nutshell, no. It doesn't necessarily matter what device you're on. It's always going to be the timing that you set it in the admin panel. Now, there is a spot in the admin panel of Google Analytics where you can either decrease the session time or increase it for timeouts. And when I say session time, it's a little bit misleading. It's just amount of time that has to elapse without actually hearing back from the user, right? And I actually don't ever recommend tweaking that. And the reason why is because it's been 30 minutes for as long as I can remember. Most people understand that line in the sand in terms of they have to interact before 30 minutes from a reporting standpoint. And if you change that, you may inadvertently change the interpretation of all the reports moving forward. And I promise you, most analysts are not going in and checking that configuration prior to determining any sort of session or usage-based items. So there is no difference on desktop or different devices in terms of session timing, unless you go in and change it, which I do not recommend. Good question, though. So moving on from data-driven attribution, there are a handful of different integrations that are part of GA360. One of the items that you'll see here, Google Ads, this integration is actually part of the standard version as well. But Google is moving in the direction of integrating their Google Marketing Platform services, Display and Video 360, Optimize 360 surveys, BigQuery, Data Studio, et cetera, to try to turn Google Analytics into a hub of your data and your reporting, allowing all of that data that's housed within it to flow downstream to other systems. So for example, mechanisms like the user ID overwrite that starts to bind together the users throughout your digital ecosystem and drop that information in 360. The idea is that you can permeate out that information into your advertising platforms. And things such as like the data-driven attribution model start to get a lot more interesting when you start feeding it more data, because there's more data points for it to measure against and determine success and weight. I would, if integrations are something that is important to you, it's almost a 360 must. One of the integrations that I'd love to point out is Optimize 360. Optimize is an external tool used for A/B and multivariate testing. It's similar to things such as Hotjar and SessionCam, Crazy Egg, ClickTail. There's a whole bunch out there. Google Analytics 360 did have a lighter version of running experiments, but Google Analytics 360, the platform itself, has always been like a testing ground for things such as, like there was dashboards that rolled out for analytics before they created Data Studio. There was experiments rolled out in analytics before they branched it off into Optimize 360. But Optimize 360 is cool because it can actually dictate the experiments, and you can start building out those experiences in there based on the data you're collecting in Analytics 360. Now, with these advertising integrations, what ends up happening is you get a better continuity of understanding about the user. So if you start doing integrations with Google Ads, for example, as part of the standard version, you start getting a lot more fleshed out material in terms of the minute details around attribution. Because as we know, as our marketing machines grow and our channels begin to start to have their own teams and have their own initiatives and campaigns, what ends up happening is that it's less about who was the last interaction, and it's more about what your contribution was in the user's tale or their story or their journey to actually get to that conversion. So Google Analytics 360, the data that's housed within, and once they're on the page, once I'm on your website, I'm a few chapters into my story. What you really want to understand as part of attribution is those steps beforehand. How did I get there? How was I acquired? And if I'm returning. Now, another aspect too, this little hub here, we talked about the Google suite of tools and how you can integrate those relatively seamlessly. The cost data import is actually another tool that opens the door to other services, including competing services. We actually just, I know I personally worked with a group that was doing an integration to build out cost data around Facebook display and cost per click, around Bing, around Yahoo. Any marketing platform that has a meaningful way to export cost data, within GA360, you have the ability to import that cost data into it. And this, once again, contributes to attribution because you start fleshing out the quality of traffic and the cost of that traffic. Because that's a big part of attribution too. I know a lot of us are after, credit, just to be kind of crass. So you want to know if you won or not, sort of thing. But also it comes down to dollars and cents. People want to know how much it is costing you to acquire users and conversions. Again, for example, if I click on a Facebook ad, I click on a Google ad, I click on an organic and converts, I'm going to want to know the cost of that Facebook ad. I'm going to want to know the cost of that Google ad, and I'm going to lump that into the cost of the conversion. Cost data imports makes up for that competitive disadvantage that we have when we're trying to compare Google data and Facebook data by opening the door between the two. Because I can tell you, because they're two competing companies, they're never going to necessarily, I don't want to say never, but they're not going to have a seamless integration. So what cost data import does is it allows you to build out the mechanisms manually by uploading different spreadsheets or building out automations to do so, which is extremely valuable to understanding, again, the first half of that user journey. So another question here too, how important is the naming convention for integration within GA and say other integral parts like Datarama? Could you clarify what you mean by naming conventions? Is this in relation to like UTM parameters? UTM, yeah. Okay, so when it comes to UTM parameters, there's a lot of best practices in it. And I always jokingly say, usually it matters less what you choose and it matters more that you're consistent. Right? It's like which side of the road is the right side of the road to drive on. It doesn't matter so long as everybody agrees. That's ultimately what needs to happen. So the naming conventions for UTM parameters are extremely important, mostly because what can end up happening is if you have different nomenclature and different naming conventions for the way that you're building this out, what can happen is you can fragment your data as it's being collected. And it could be as simple as case difference. So for example, if I am sending an email and the medium I choose is email, I use it all lowercase and the next person has an uppercase email, that will actually branch off into two different mediums and potentially fragment that data. What ends up happening is you start to lose data to human error that way. So the more that you can standardize your nomenclature and naming conventions, the better off you're going to be. Additionally, too, I'd mentioned, and we'll go into much more detail on the next part, but when you teach Google Analytics to consume the values that you're sending it with the default channel groupings and the channel groupings in general, you're going to want to make sure that you set up the rules to consume it, and that your team, that your organization, make sure it feeds those values in that match those rules. Because what happens, and I would challenge you guys too on this call, if you're looking at Google Analytics right now, if you navigate go to your production view, the one that you do the most analysis out of, on the left-hand side under acquisition, go to your all traffic and channels report. If in that report, you see a row in that report that says other with parentheses, and it's a big chunk of your inbound traffic, that essentially means a couple of things. You either have, high percentage other. That either means one, you have good UTM tagging practices, but you didn't configure GTM to consume them. Or two, you have inconsistent tagging practices, and that's the fall off. And what ends up happening is that other bucket, I jokingly call it's like the kitchen junk drawer of marketing, right? Google just doesn't know what to do with it, so they just kind of shove it in other and hope for the best, but that's not good enough, right? We got to fix that. So do keep an eye on that. Keep an eye on direct, keep an eye on other. Good questions though. So that essentially concludes this part. And I spoke a lot about the consumption of this data, how this data is collected, how this data is weighted. On our next session for part 2, we're going to dive into the reporting aspects and talk about essentially how we use these integrations, how we use this data to report against it, to build out a presentation, to build out something that is meaningful and clear to those that you're essentially reporting this data to. So I'll take a moment here, and I know we have a few minutes left. So if anybody has any questions, either drop it into the chat or the QA. While you guys are thinking through that as well, I'm actually just going to launch a poll for you guys. If you could just take a real quick moment to answer this. This is if you're interested in connecting with our team. We can talk to you a little bit more about Analytics 360 if you'd like, or our services in general. Also too, if you're interested in just reaching out to me directly, feel free to add me on LinkedIn. Okay, guys, thank you so much for your time this afternoon, and I hope you have a great rest of your week. I look forward, hopefully everybody connects with me next time for part 2, which we'll dive into the reporting. And again, if you have any questions in the interim, hit me up on LinkedIn, and we'll talk soon, and have a great day.